Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Friday, September 13th around here, and we have a great show for you today. A little bit of a chiller day on the side of previewing games this upcoming weekend. So let's get you updated on a lot of the news going on. We have the Pac-12. It does live. We have a couple of teams joining the Pac-12 in a couple of years, and we have to talk about what's going to happen after that. So we'll get into all of that today in the first segment. Then we'll get to a week 3 whip around. We'll get to all the games that we haven't gotten to throughout the week. Just touch on them pretty quickly, including the one that happened last night. That was a ton of fun. And then we'll get into my best bets for this upcoming weekend. Went 5-3 last week, so off to a pretty good start. We'll see how we can continue that. And then we'll do a little bit of a recruiting update. Have not done this in quite some time, but with the season going on, there's been a lot of recruitments heating up, a lot of guys taking visits, and I want to make sure that I have that on y'all's radar. And then we'll finish it up with a little bit of a headline wrap-up. We had some stuff going on with Sharon Moore in Michigan, as well as a couple of former Michigan players suing the NCAA, as well as Big Ten Network. So plenty to get to today. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use that super chat at the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page. Great way for you all to get involved in the show. Want this to be as interactive as possible, so utilize that super chat if you would like. And also, the GSMCpodcast.net page is still up and running if you would like to utilize that. So either of those work. Super Chat tends to be a little bit easier, but if you want to use the website, that is up and running as usual. But let's go ahead and jump into this. Oh my goodness, I apologize for the placement of that. But let's go ahead and jump into this Pac-12 news. There is so much stuff going on around realignment, but the Pac-12 does live. We have gotten the Pac-12 back, at least for the time being. It sounds like we are getting 4 teams added to the Pac-12. Boise State, San Diego State, Colorado State, and Fresno State are going to join the Pac-12 in 2026, it sounds. This was announced yesterday by the Pac-12, and now we got to figure out what comes next. But let's get into the details of this real quickly. Obviously, they got to pay for this. They're going to have to pay the Mountain West, I believe, around $113 million throughout this contract if they want to get these guys out of their contract just a little bit early. It's going to cost something like $14 million per team, and then you have a little bit of an extra fee because of how quickly it's happening. So they're going to use that little bit of a war chest they've built up from the other 10 teams leaving the Pac-12 to pay this debt. And it'll be really, really interesting to watch all of this unfold. And I think one of the big things here is, obviously, they got the 4 teams that they needed. When you talk about the Mountain West, those 4 teams are comfortably the biggest teams in that conference. They're comfortably the best teams in that conference. But when you look at the grand scheme of things, they still have to get to 8 for the NCAA to really recognize them as a conference. So we'll have to see how this kind of develops over time. But at the end of the day, I think in the ACC is someone, Anthony, that is going to have to think about this. You know, there are a lot of teams that are looking at the door, and they're going to have to think about some alternative measures, I suppose, and we'll talk about kind of a couple of teams that could come into the fray for the Pac-12 if the ACC starts to struggle. But as of right now, it seems like everything's kind of cooled down on the ACC front, so we'll see what happens. I think Clemson and Florida State are finding their way out. I just think it might take a little bit longer than we once thought. But getting into these 4 teams, obviously Boise State is the team that you would want. Boise State has been a part of the fabric of college football for quite some time and has a great athletic department as a whole. Is going to be a great addition and likely was the number 1 on this list, if I had to imagine, for the Pac-12. And then you had Colorado State, another great option, gives you a little bit more of a, Colorado presence, which is lovely. You have a Pac-12 versus Big 12 rivalry with Colorado, so definitely helps that as well. So it's going to be a really fun addition. I think that's a team that definitely adds a lot to this, and I think it's one of those that likely might have been on the chopping block if they could get UNLV into the room, but it sounds like that's not going, or it sounds like that might be a little bit harder to happen, at least in the short term, but we'll get to that here in a second. And then you got San Diego State. This is one of the most consistent products in terms of athletic department in the entirety of the Mountain West. They have a solid football program. Well, at least it has been in the past. The basketball program obviously is coming off a really remarkable run to the Final Four, and a lot of different things going on around there that this is an absolute no-brainer of a decision, frankly. And then you have Fresno State, one of the most consistent products in the world of college football, especially at the G5 level. This is a layup as well. This is probably the other team that was at the very top of the list. So definitely a very good addition. I think all four of these teams make a lot of sense in the Pac-12. Keeps kind of that regional feel to the Pac-12 that I very much want to stick around, and we'll get to that here in a second. But there's a lot of different things about these four teams that just add so much to the Pac-12 and keep them back in the conversation, which is what we all want at the end of the day, to keep that Pac-12 after dark going and make sure it's really, really fun matchups. So I think Anthony, it's definitely an out there conspiracy theory. There's no doubt about that. I think Jim Phillips is one of those guys that has a lot of stuff surrounding him pretty much at all times in college football, just because he's bounced around so many different times. It'll be interesting to see how that lays out, because as of right now, if you're picking anyone that is setting their sights on the ACC, it would be the Big Ten, right? They're definitely looking at them as possibly someone that they can kind of rip to pieces once they go, over the deep end, and a lot of these teams end up leaving. They would be the ones to jump after UNC and Virginia and a lot of the other teams. So it's one of those things that the Big Ten is definitely the conference that is pushing the hardest against the ACC, it feels like right now. So who knows? I'll leave it at that as of right now. It's one of those things that I think at the end of the day, the Big Ten and the SEC is just going to take what's handed to them. And if they have to, push the ACC off the cliff just a little bit to get some of those teams, I wouldn't necessarily say that's out of the realm of possibility. But as for the Pac-12, they got to find a couple other teams. They have to find a couple of teams that are going to make a difference in this new world as they get to 8 teams. And for me, UNLV is where the conversation starts, and this kind of adds a interesting conversation to the mix, because the reality is UNLV and Nevada are both in the Mountain West, and they're kind of tied to each other. There's a world where UNLV can join the Pac-12, and they probably would have in this iteration of expansion, but the reality is, if Nevada doesn't go, then UNLV pretty much cannot go as of right now. Now, there is still plenty of time to figure that out, and I would have to imagine that if they want to figure it out hard enough, they absolutely will. I feel pretty confident about that, but the reality is you still have to figure out how to split these two up, or you bring both of them along. And that kind of brings me to the question of who else is on that group? Who else is in the UNLV group of things, and how you kind of view this group that they could possibly add? And it's a lot of different teams. Memphis, Tulane, UTSA are all American teams. And I've talked about this before very briefly when we talked about this yesterday, but I don't think it would be all that easy to get a team out of the American and into the Pac-12. I do think the Pac-12 has that, emblem, has that logo, has all of that stuff, but it's hard for me to say that teams would be better off in the Pac-12 than they would be in the AAC. So it's one of those things that I wouldn't necessarily think is all that on the table. Now, one of the big time debates in here is what happens with the CFP if the Pac-12 gets more involved. Maybe they have an agreement on the table. They did agree to that CFP very, very easily, and it's not very kind to them right about now. So the question is, what if they get to those 8 teams and then they're involved in the auto bid system? That would be a huge reason for Memphis or Tulane or UTSA to find their way over. And then from the Pac-12's perspective, you want to expand a little bit, right? Regionality is pretty much gone in this sport, so it's about making as much money as you can. And I think UTSA bringing that Texas market over, or you could add Texas State, who had a great game yesterday, we'll talk about here in a second. But overall, I think you want to add different sites. You want to add different hubs, and I think they could go down to Florida, add someone like USF. There's a million different possibilities here, but the reality is, I think as it stands right this second, I can't tell you that the American is a worse place to hang out than the Pac-12. If the CFP stuff changes, then we're having a real conversation. But as of right now, I think Memphis, Tulane, and UTSA are plenty happy where they are. But then you have Cal and Stanford, the two ACC teams that used to be Pac-12 teams, and I think this would happen in the case that we were talking about, Anthony, in the case of possibly these disbanding, or the ACC kind of crumbling around itself and those teams just looking for a home. I think that's probably the reality where you'd see this, because it's going to cost way too much money to get them out of their contract right about now. So this is kind of like if Cal and Stanford are available, I expect them to be in the Pac-12. But as of right now, I don't expect them to be available until the end of that deal. But we'll see what happens, obviously. Definitely a lot of things that could go wrong or could go right in that scenario for the Pac-12, and we'll see. But overall, I think that one's a little bit further on in the future. And then you get to the West Coast teams, UNLV, Air Force, Wyoming, New Mexico, a lot of these teams that would be very good fits. I think I would start with UNLV, obviously. I think New Mexico would be a great pick. I think Air Force would also be a great pick. And if they're not getting picked up by the Pac-12, I expect them to find another Group of 5 conference relatively quickly, honestly. A fairly good product and one that is getting better every single year. But my picks would be Nevada and UNLV, and that's a little bit selfish, I won't lie to you, because I want this to be a regional conference. I want this to be that last hope for keeping regionality in the sport, so I'd love them to add the two Nevada teams and keep moving forward that way. I don't feel necessarily great about both those things happening. I think UNLV is a real possibility down the road. I think right now Nevada is very far from what the Pac-12 wants. But I think, Anthony, when you talk about NDSU and South Dakota State, the issue is there is such a large gap that is really hard to see on the football field, obviously, just because how good those teams are. There's a relatively huge gap between those teams financially and teams like Boise State, teams like Fresno State, teams like San Diego State. So as good as those products are from an athletic department standpoint, they're not going to bring in quite enough money from the media standpoint for you to really justify bringing them in. So as great as that would be, and as frankly as fun as that would be for me, I think it's one of those things that is going to be a little bit harder to do. If they were to join the FBS and then build up over a couple of years, then I think it's a real possibility. But as of now, I think the finances are just a little bit too far from where the Pac-12 wants to be. But overall, I mean, incredible job by the Pac-12. Mountain West got to figure out what they do from here, because there's a real reality where they just, disintegrate into oblivion after this, because they're losing their 4 biggest brands, and I wouldn't be surprised if a couple other went with them. So it's going to be really tough for the Mountain West. Huge shout out to the Pac-12 and their commissioner, Teresa Gould. She took over a very tough situation when George Kliavkoff walked off and did an incredible job of rebuilding this conference, putting them in a position to succeed, and finally hitting the jackpot, adding a couple of teams that are going to be huge entities going forward. But you got to get 2 more teams, and then you got to find a media deal. Going to be very, very tough to do that, but if you can find a media deal that hits around $15 million per school, around that number, you might just be dubbed as a Power 5 program and have more of a power in those CFP discussions. So it's one of those things that they got their 4 teams, they've got the ball rolling. There is still so much work to go for the Pac-12. They have to figure out, who they're adding next, how they're getting to 8 teams. Then they got to figure out how they're getting a media deal. Then they got to figure out a lot of other stuff in terms of the playoffs. So this is a great start. No two ways about that. The Pac-12 has obviously gotten a start that they very much needed in this realignment world, and they came back from the dead in a lot of ways that I thought they were kind of done, and those 2 schools were just going to look for anything they could at this point. That doesn't seem to be the case. They are officially on the map again, and we'll see what those next 2 teams are, and we'll see if it's enough to give them enough power in those CFP discussions. But it's one of those things, Anthony, I think that's a very interesting concept. I think there is a conference out there that will take that form. I think as many of them are trying to avoid that for as long as possible. And that will be a very interesting conversation as the House settlement and everything gets put into place and more bills come on the table for these guys. But as of right now, you have so many great moneymakers that are outside the Olympic sports space that it's going to be really hard to sell a lot of these big conferences on it. Now, if you go a little bit further down, then maybe you'll find someone that's a little bit less inclined to give up that money for football and put more into the Olympic sports. And frankly, I think that'd be kind of a really cool concept just to see how that would unfold. But we'll finish it off there for that segment. Definitely going to be an interesting thing to watch, and we'll keep you updated on all of the stuff as you need to know it. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to do a little bit of a week 3 whip around. We've gotten to a lot of games this week, but haven't quite gotten to all of the ones I want to, so we'll touch on all of those right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the Pac-12 adding 4 teams from the Mountain West, a couple of really good teams in there. Boise State, Fresno State, San Diego State, and Colorado State. All states over there, so it's going to be really interesting to watch that, but got to add a couple more teams. We will keep you updated as they do, because sounds like that's going to happen relatively quickly. But let's get to a little bit of a Week 3 wrap-up. There are so many different games that we have not gotten a chance to get to, and want to make sure that we touch on them before Saturday gets around. And I want to start with one that happened actually yesterday. Arizona State edges out Texas State in this one by 3 points. This one was really fun. In the first half, it was back and forth. We had a 21-7 lead in Texas State's direction, and then Arizona State came roaring back. Sam Leavitt played a very pretty first half, tied this game at 21-21 going into halftime, and then really Arizona State's defense took over. They were incredible the rest of this game, outscored Texas State about 24-7, was doing the math really quickly there, throughout the rest of this game, and they did a really good job on the other side of things. They held Cam Scatterbo, the very talented Arizona State running back, 24 carries, 62 yards. He did get in the end zone twice and showed up when they needed it down the stretch, but the reality is, if you're keeping that guy to those type of numbers, you're likely doing your job defensively. So I was really impressed with Texas State. I think they're a team that is going to have plenty to say about that Group of 5 bid into the playoff. Jordan McLeod had 265, 4 touchdowns, and then a not great timing pick at the very end of the game. But overall, I think this is one of those that it just came down to the end of the game, and the Power 5 team had more at their disposal. The game ended with a fumble, an interception, and a turnover on downs for Texas State, so not the way that you wanted to do it, but a huge win for Arizona State, and they have already tied their win total from last year. So huge respect to Kenny Dillingham and getting those boys ready to roll, and now they head into conference play, and they see if they can shock the world by being voted the worst team in this conference to being voted the best. We'll see what happens with them, but obviously a great start and a big-time win in San Marcos yesterday. I wanted to touch on this one very quickly because this is insane. They played 6-minute rolling quarters in the fourth quarter for this one because it got so ugly. But South Alabama only didn't score on one drive in this game, and it was a missed field goal. So it could have been 90-10. But the reality is this was an absolute beatdown, just ridiculous what South Alabama did to them. But one of those things that you see early on in the season every now and then. I feel like Northwestern State has been on the wrong side of this a couple of times this year, but a big-time win for South Alabama, obviously, in their first win of the season. Let's get into Memphis at Florida State. We've talked about this one a little bit throughout the week, but this one's going to get really interesting. Florida State's favored by 6.5 points right now, and the reality is this one needs to be a message sender. There's no other reality where Florida State can live in if they fall in this game, because if they fall in this game, there's so many different things that have to happen around that program that are not going to happen overnight, that are going to take time, like turning more of your attention away from the portal and towards high school recruiting, like overhauling a lot of that roster, especially with some of the defenders that are going to be leaving this offseason. You're going to have a lot to replace in that defensive room, as well as that offense that, frankly, you probably want to replace a lot of that offense. But the reality is there's going to be so many different things that they're going to have to fix. And if you start 0-3, especially with the loss to a G5 team, there's going to be a lot of recruits that are looking elsewhere, and there are already recruits looking elsewhere that we'll talk about here in a second, or in a couple of segments. But overall, I think when you look at this game, the quarterback advantage goes to Memphis. Seth Hannigan has been nearly perfect throughout this year, 42 for 60, 469 yards, 3 touchdowns through 2 games, and no INTs, which is the big-time difference between him and DJ. He is not going to put the ball into harm's way. He's going to make the right decision and then just go about the business. He's very comfortable in this offense, and it really does does show. And then Mario Anderson, a South Carolina transfer who you might not know about too much, but he was huge for that South Carolina offense down the stretch of last season, and he's a really good player. One of those guys that, frankly, could be playing on Florida State right about now, but decided to go to Memphis, and it's one of those things that if I'm looking at this game objectively from a football perspective, I'm having a hard time leaning towards Florida State, but the reality is they have to win this game, and they have to know that. They have to know that going into this game, the defense is going to have to play lights out. The offense is going to have to pick their moments and have to get somewhat of a run game going. You have to assume Florida State gets this one done, but as of right now, I would not touch this game in terms of betting it, because I would lean in Memphis if I was just using my football brain, but when you bring all of the other stuff into it, I feel like it has to be Florida State. But we'll see what happens. If it's not Florida State, then we're having a very interesting conversation on Monday. I can almost promise you that. But let's get into Cincinnati at Miami of Ohio, because this is going to be a really fun matchup. This is one that could really help the G5 when it comes to playoff implications, because this is a Miami of Ohio team that very much has their eyes set on the MAC title. I think they're the best team in the MAC, although what we saw from Northern Illinois a week ago, I still think Miami of Ohio is the more solid team, and they're coming off a really tough offensive game against Northwestern in week 1, but then they had a little bit of a bye, which was very, very weird this early in the season, but they're going to be fully ready to go. Brett Gabbert is a very solid quarterback in this offense, has done a great job. Yes, Blaine Gabbert's brother, if you're wondering, but a very talented kid and someone that definitely can make some stuff happen. I think since he is coming off a really devastating loss to Pitt that was just terrible in that fourth quarter. Pitt came back from, I believe, at least 14 down to win that game, and they're just looking for a win. Brendan Sorsby has been all right through a couple of games, but has not been necessarily what they hoped, and they did get Dante Corleone back last week, which is absolutely huge. Great to see him back on the field, one of the best defensive tackles in the entire country. I think I'd lean Cincinnati here, but this one's going to be really close. I think Miami of Ohio has every ability to win this game, and if they do, then we're definitely talking about them in the CFP picture, that's for sure. And then you got Notre Dame heading over to Purdue. This is one of those games that a lot of people have been talking about this one as, okay, Notre Dame can roll in, they can get a quick win, and they can go back to business. I'm not sure that's going to be that easy. I don't think Purdue is all that great of a team necessarily, and I don't necessarily think they're going to compete for the Big Ten, but you look at that offense, it can roll, and they also had a bye last week. They had a week 1 game where Hudson Card had 1 incompletion and 4 touchdowns, and then they got to sit and they got to wait for this game. And it's one of those things that Notre Dame has to go to their house now. So it's one of those places that you would assume Notre Dame could get right. You would assume that Notre Dame could get in the win column and keep moving on about their year. This is not a Purdue team that's going to hand you a lot of stuff. And Ryan Walters in his second year seems to be a lot more comfortable in this offense. It seems like Hudson Card is a lot more comfortable calling this offense from the line. So there's a lot of different things going in Purdue's direction, but I think Notre Dame can win. I think this one's going to be downright gross, if I'm being totally honest with you. I think this one's going to be a little bit, chippy at times, a little bit run heavy for sure, but I do think Notre Dame gets it done. I just think this one is really, really tough for them, and one of those that if it goes the wrong direction, their season falls off a cliff very, very quickly. West Virginia going over to Pitt is a very interesting one. This line opened at minus 5.5 towards West Virginia's direction, so a lot of people going Pitt's direction after that incredible win over Cincy. I tend to believe they're a little bit overreacting, if I'm being honest. I do like Eli Holstein, the Bama quarterback, came off a really great performance a week ago. Kanata Mumfield is someone to watch in this game, really talented wide receiver, and is going to be a tough cover for just about anyone in the country. But this is one of those games that I think West Virginia is still a really good team. I think they played not so great football in week 1 against Penn State, but I think they're one of those teams that is going to find themselves throughout the year, and I think this is one of those games where a lot of people are overreacting to the week that just happened, and I think West Virginia is going to respond and get a big-time win here, if I had to imagine. But going to be a tough fight, very fun to watch, but I'm going to lean West Virginia in this one. Indiana going over to UCLA is the first weird Big Ten matchup. We get Indiana heading all the way down to LA to play a game, and it's going to be just fascinating to watch this unfold because we're going to see it a ton of times throughout the year and throughout the next couple of years with UCLA and USC, and it's one of those games that you look at it on paper, Indiana has the better team. They have so many different things going for them in this game, and I think UCLA is coming off a bye week, actually, where they had, because they had a very ugly Week 1 win against Hawaii. But overall, I think this is an Indiana team that is going to be ready to go. I think Curtis Rourke is a very solid quarterback for them, and Elijah Surratt, or as he calls himself, Waffle House, because he's open 24/7. I think this is going to be a really fun team throughout the year. I think Indiana kind of rolls in this one, if I'm being honest. I don't love this UCLA team, and I think they still have tons to figure out before they can really get rolling. Colorado State is one that everyone is going to be locked into. A super fun game, and one of those that I just cannot wait to see unfold because it's going to get heated. I can absolutely promise you that. When you look around the country, you find all of the teams that just outright hate each other. This is one of the ones on the short list because we saw what happened a year ago. They do not like each other. Torrey Horton and Braden Fowler Nicolosi were talking a little trash earlier on this week about how they should have killed Colorado last year. Did not happen. So it's going to be a very, very fun game in Fort Collins this upcoming weekend. Colorado obviously has struggled through a couple of weeks, has not looked as clean as you want, but Colorado State has not looked very clean, and Torrey Horton is kind of nursing a little bit of an injury. If he's not ready to go, then it's going to be very interesting to watch this one unfold. This is absolutely has to go Colorado's direction. I talked about it yesterday, but this is where we learn just so much about what Colorado is under Deion Sanders, and I think they got to get it done. I do like them in this one. I think Colorado State is a little bit more clunky than people have kind of want to believe going into this game. Obviously, a lot of Colorado haters in particular, but overall, I think this is one of those games that Colorado's just got to be able to handle business. They're going to be able to score. I can almost promise you that. But it's going to be really fun to watch this one. I'm going to lean Colorado, but definitely going to be locked into this one at 7:30 on Saturday. And then finally, UCF going to TCU. This is a really fun game. UCF heading over to Fort Worth for their first Big 12 game of the year, and this one's going to get really interesting. This line has bounced kind of all over the place, but it stayed within 1 point pretty much the entire time. So this is going to be a very, very fun game. I think it's going to be a little bit back and forth. UCF has obviously been eating on the ground with that running back duo and KJ Jefferson, but have missed the mark through the air, as KJ Jefferson has done in the past. So it's one of those things where they're likely going to have to find a pass game throughout this conference play if they're really going to want to make some noise, and it's going to have to start on Saturday likely. I think TCU is cruising right along. They're playing really solid football, and I think Josh Hoover is a lot more comfortable in this offense in year two. I think Cam Cook as well is a lot more comfortable. So I think TCU gets this one. I think it's going to be really, really fun, really close game, but overall I do like TCU to steal that one in Fort Worth. But a lot of really fun games this upcoming weekend. I think there's a number that I haven't even touched on that probably will be the game of the week because I don't think I touched on Northern Illinois Notre Dame going into last week. So it's going to be really fun to watch this one unfold. But let's take our second break here. And when we come back, we're going to get into my best bets for the week. We've gotten through all of the games. Let's get into what I think is going to happen. And went 5-3 last week. So hopefully we can keep that rolling this week. So we'll do that right after this. So stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the other games that we hadn't got a chance to get to throughout the week. Definitely some really fun ones, including Colorado State, Colorado, and UCF heading over to Fort Worth to face off against TCU. A couple of really fun ones to finish off your Saturday there. But let's get into the best bets that I have for today, and there are a couple that I feel pretty good about in this bunch, and I feel weird about feeling really good about them, frankly, if I'm being honest. But let's get into this. A couple of them that I think are going to be really solid, and this is one of them. This is a game that is very interesting because neither of these teams have looked all that explosive on offense. Arizona looked great in the first game, but when you're playing New Mexico, a lot of things can go right offensively. I do think in the second game, both these teams looked a little bit clunky. They didn't really necessarily get what they wanted to get going on the offensive side of the ball, and I think it's added some questions to this game about how good these teams are, which team needs to get it going, which team needs to really turn that corner as they head into Big 12 play. This is not a Big 12 game, just a reminder. This is an out-of-conference game because everything is out of whack this year. So this is an out-of-conference game right about now, so going to be really interesting to watch this one unfold. But I think the biggest thing for me here is Kansas State has to use Avery Johnson's legs. In the first week, Devin Dampier, who is a downright special athlete but is right up there with Avery Johnson, he had over 100 yards with his legs, and I think that's something that Kansas State has not unlocked thus far throughout this year, and they just have to on Saturday. There's no world where they're going to be able to compete in the Big 12 if they're not able to get that run game going with Avery Johnson involved. So I expect that to be a bigger part of the offense. And then as for Arizona, Tulane had wide receivers running free last week against Kansas State. There were so many wide open receivers that got tons after the catch. There's no T-Mac on the Tulane roster. There is only one T-Mac in the entire country, and he's downright terrifying. I think Arizona has every ability to score on this Kansas offense, but on this Kansas defense, and I think on the other side, Kansas is just going to be too multiple. I think Arizona has a couple of really good players, but the reality is if you can avoid Takario Davis and Jacob Manu on that defense, you're going to have a lot of success, just the reality. So I think both these teams kind of find something a little bit on the offensive side of the ball in this game. I did pick Kansas State to win this game, but it's going to be a really fun one tonight. Cannot wait for this one, but I do think we're going to see some fireworks. We're going to see both these offenses that are so much fun put up some points for us on tonight's game. I do like Alabama against this pretty big spread, and I think this is one of those games that a lot of people are looking at in terms of what Alabama did last week. They're saying Alabama came out shaky. They let a couple of games on the back end looked a little bit shaky at times. There were a lot of issues with the way they went about business against USF, and no argument here by any means. Wisconsin has looked 10 times worse. There has been 2 games this year where they've beaten 2 very much inferior opponents by 14 points, have not scored more than 28 points in both those games. I don't think this offense is going to be able to get much of anything going against Kane Womack's defense. And then I think this is one of those games also that Wisconsin's going to have to hit big plays. Tyler Van Dyke has to play a nearly perfect game on Saturday if they're going to have a shot to win, and he's going to have to hit shots downfield, and that's not necessarily what he does all that well, and it's absolutely not what this offense does well. So even when Alabama gives them those openings to go deep, I don't think they have the ability to exploit them. Now, in a couple of weeks, UGA absolutely will have the ability, but for right now, it feels like Alabama is one of those teams that I think a lot of people are picking against them because of what they saw from them, but aren't necessarily addressing what they saw from Wisconsin. I think this team is very far from where they want to be in Madison, and I think they take full advantage of that, especially Jalen Milroe on the ground. I think he's going to have a huge effect on this game, and I think it's just one of those that I know 16 is a big number. I know Alabama heading up north is a very interesting proposition, but this Wisconsin team has so many questions on offense that I'm not even sure if they're going to be able to score on this Alabama defense, at least not consistently. And then on the other side, you have so many explosive players that could make that one big play that I just think Alabama is going to be able to pull away late in this one or even early in this one and then hold on to a lead. I like North Texas to cover the spread against Texas Tech, and I think this is one of those games where if Texas Tech can't stop anyone defensively, if they're just going to be a team that's going to be able to essentially whatever you want to do on offense, you're going to be able to do it against Texas Tech. They're not going to be able to blow out any team on their schedule. I believe the over-under for this game is near 70, so it's not like they're expecting a lot of defense in this game, and I think it's one of those that you have Chandler Morris on the other sideline for North Texas, who obviously has bounced around a little bit, but he's played Power 4 football. He's played Big 12 football at a very high level, and he's one of those guys that has over 700 passing yards through 2 weeks, number 2 in the country right now. He's going to be able to take advantage of this Texas Tech back end. And then I think Texas Tech is going to be able to score, but the reality is they gave up 51 points to Abilene Christian in week 1, gave up 37 to Washington State in week 2, I don't think it's going to get all that prettier with North Texas. I understand North Texas is not necessarily the greatest team in the world. They're better than Abilene Christian, and they can definitely spread the ball out a little bit more often. So I think this one is very, very close. I do think Texas Tech likely gets it done, but it's one of those teams right now that I don't know if I can say anything confidently about that Texas Tech team, particularly that defense right about now. So I expect a really fun game over there in Lubbock and cannot wait to see this one unfold. I do like Boston College plus the points against Missouri. This is one that I've seen a lot of people go the other direction on. I just don't know what this Missouri team is yet. I still have my worries about that defense being able to bounce back the way that they need to after all of the losses they had a year ago. They have a lot of really, really talented players, and they're playing really high-level football right about now, but I think Thomas Castellanos can cause just enough problems. I don't think it has to be necessarily anything crazy for this Boston College team. I don't think they have to score 45 points or 30 points to stay in this like this, but I do think they have to at least hit a couple of big plays, and I think it's going to be nearly impossible to keep Thomas Castellanos under wraps for the entire 4 quarters. So it's one of those where Missouri's been able to win their games pretty comfortably, and frankly, I think at the end of the day, this one will look relatively comfortable, but I do think it's one of those that Missouri could come out a little bit slow. Maybe Boston College gets that first touchdown on the board, and then Missouri's fighting back from a 23-point deficit rather than a 16-point. So it's going to be really interesting to watch this one unfold. I do think Missouri is a really, really good team. I just think this is the first game where they're really being tested. I don't think it's crazy to think they come a little bit slow out of the gates. Boston College gets a couple of touchdowns, maybe a touchdown and a field goal on the board, and then you have a little bit of breathing room in this pick. So a lot of people go in the other direction, expecting Missouri to blow them out, and that is definitely a possibility in this game. But I think Boston College is playing really confident football, and I would pick the Golden Eagles in this one, at least to cover that spread of 16. I love West Virginia to cover the spread against Pitt. This is one of those games that I think Pitt is coming off an emotional comeback victory against Cincinnati. So many people are riding high off that performance and are pushing into this Pitt kind of narrative. I just don't think this is all that great of a team, and I don't think Cincinnati is all that great of a team, frankly. So I think this is one of those games where a lot of people are overreacting to the first couple of weeks. West Virginia did not look good in the first week. There's no doubt about that, but I do think they got to make a point in this one. I think they want to prove that, first of all, they can beat a team in the state of Pennsylvania would be nice, but the reality is I do think getting this win would really kickstart them into the Big 12, and I just still think this is a really good team. I still think this is a team that has every ability to compete in the Big 12, and I think Garrett Green definitely is going into this game knowing that he's going to have to really perform. This line went from 5.5 in West Virginia's favor all the way down to 2, so I think this is going to be a really fun game, but I think people are overreacting to that line a little bit, and I think West Virginia definitely covers that spread of 2 points. I love TCU against UCF, and it's one of those that I feel a little bit nervous about, I won't lie. With all of the talent on the UCF side, I think this is one of those that is going to be just ridiculous to watch, frankly, on Saturday night. But TCU was a half-point favorite when this line opened. Now it's flipped to UCF -1, and it's going to be a really fun game. I don't think there's any reality where one of these teams blows the other out, but as I'm saying that, that's probably what's going to happen, frankly. But it's going to be a really fun game. I think TCU's kind of finding themselves. I think last year was obviously not the year that they wanted to have, but Josh Hoover is back for his second year. Cam Cook is healthy finally, so they're so much more dangerous on that offensive side of the ball than they were a year ago. Jack Besh is making a ton of plays at wide receiver. I think is a really solid team, and I think UCF is a solid team. I don't think they're going to have the pass game to be able to confuse this TCU defense enough. I think they're going to have to run the ball, and at a certain point, TCU is just going to sell out to stop you. It's not necessarily going to be easy to stop UCF, but I think they can get just enough to get this one done, and I do like TCU in this game quite a bit. I think TCU gets this one done and starts UCF on a very bad note for the Big 12 and maybe gives themselves a little bit of hope going into the Big 12 schedule. This is one I absolutely love. I think this is an absolute layup, if I'm being totally honest, and just as surely as I'm saying that, it's going to be about 10-7 on Saturday in this one. But this is one of those that I think when you look at what Auburn did a week ago, there's so many people worried about that offense, so many people worried about what Peyton Thorne is. The thing is, New Mexico gave up 61 points to Arizona in week 1, and Arizona does have the best receiver of the bunch in T-Mac, but Auburn might have the next three. When you talk about the freshman wide receivers, Keandre Lambert-Smith, there's going to be too many guys for New Mexico to keep track of, so there's a reality where Auburn hits this by themselves. I think they could go absolutely crazy on the offensive side of the ball and let a lot of fans feel a little bit better about Peyton Thorne under center. And then on the other side, I think Devon Dampier is just too hard to keep track of. I think this Auburn defense is really solid and is going to be able to play good defense, but the reality is when you have an athlete on that other side of the ball, I think he's going to be able to score enough points. I think this is one of those games that maybe Auburn wins it like 50-14 or something like that. It's going to be likely a blowout one direction, but I think New Mexico scores enough, and I think Auburn just goes to work on this New Mexico defense, frankly. But really fun game, definitely one that if you want to see points, I would tune into this one for sure. And then finally, Colorado State, Colorado. I think this one goes over. This one I'm a little bit worried about. But when I look at both these defenses, I think Colorado State is just all over the place, especially with speed wide receivers like Texas had. Colorado has a lot of those speed wide receivers. So keeping track of all those guys is going to be incredibly tough for them to do. I think Shadir Sanders is coming into this one with a little bit more energy than he normally has. I think he really wants to win this one, especially after the performance he had last week. I think it's going to be really tough for that Colorado defense without Shiloh Sanders on that back end to just keep everything intact. He's really one of the few relatively solid tacklers in that back end of that defense, so not having him back there is just going to let these Colorado State wide receivers run essentially free. Colorado State has not necessarily been all that clean on offense, but there's very few people that are not clean on offense against Colorado. So I tend to believe that they're going to be able to get at least enough going to make this one fun. I think there's a little bit of a back and forth game, and there's a lot of intensity in this one, but I think we're going to see plenty of points as well. I think it's going to be really fun, really up and down, and I do think Colorado gets the win, but Colorado State's going to hang around. I can almost promise you. But that'll do it for that segment. We'll move on here to a little bit of a recruiting update. After this break, we'll get into all of that. There has been so much stuff happening since the season started, and just wanted to make sure you guys were fully updated before we went to another little bit of a dark period with recruiting. So we'll update you on all of that right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of my best bets for this upcoming weekend. I am 5-3 through 1 week of me doing this throughout the season, so a little bit of a heater right now. We'll see if we can keep that going this upcoming weekend. But a little bit of a recruiting update. I don't know why all my lower thirds are messed up. Apologies for that. But recruiting has been going absolutely crazy all over the country. But the biggest one of the last little bit was Jamie French, the 5-star wide receiver committing to Texas. Very talented kid out of Jacksonville, Florida. And there were a couple of teams, LSU and Miami, that were pushing very hard late in this one. But Texas was able to shut it down. They were able to build out this class even more. And they are not slowing down anytime soon. They've been on an absolute heater on the recruiting trail, and if they keep playing the way they are right now on the field, then it's going to be incredibly hard to stop this team on the recruiting trail. I can almost promise you that. But, I apologize. A very talented player, one of those guys that is almost definitely going to be an immediate contributor for this team just because of the outright speed that he brings to the table. But they add another 5-star wide receiver to that group along with Khalil Lockett and keep moving on a remarkable recruiting heater for the Texas Longhorns. Another wide receiver that came off the board is Phillip Bell III. He is committed to Ohio State. Very fast, very talented receiver. He adds to a group with Quincy Porter, Daisy Jones, Bodpen Miller, very talented wide receiver group. Not necessarily the normal wide receiver group for the Buckeyes. They usually reel in a couple of 5-stars in the group, but still a very, very talented bunch. And I think when you have Jeremiah Smith on the roster, you feel pretty good about where you are going forward at that wide receiver position. So very talented player, one of those guys that likely with a lot of those guys moving on this offseason is probably going to get a little bit of run early on in his career and cannot wait to see what he can do in that offense. Iowa got a 4-star wide receiver, Terrence Smith, a very talented kid, and one of those guys that Iowa just needs to get more of. They need to start stacking these kids as often as possible out of Aurora, Illinois, so you can stick in that area and still get very, very talented wide receivers, and then they're going to have to get a couple more in the portal. I think this offseason is as important for them as a program as really anyone they've had in the past, 10 years, really. So Iowa has a ton of things that are going to have to change after this offseason, and I think they've done a good job thus far of kind of slowly getting those changes into place, but it's about time to really kick up the heat and really get those things moving, and adding guys like Terrence Smith is really going to help that, but they're definitely going to have to do a little bit more work on the recruiting trail, and then definitely through the portal at that position in particular to keep this thing moving the way that they want to. But very, very talented kid, definitely a good start to this really solid recruiting class that Iowa's putting together, but definitely need more of these guys to come in as quickly as possible if you're Iowa. Malachi Goodman, a very talented four-star offensive tackle, has committed to Penn State, 6'5", 315. This kid is ready to play just about tomorrow. He's definitely one of those guys that could be an Olu Fashanu type player for Penn State, one of those guys that's super long, really strong, really athletic, is going to be ready to roll pretty much immediately, but likely will get a little bit of time to get his feet under him and get ready for the next level, but once he's ready, he's going to be a terrifying individual. Definitely one of those guys that I expect to be all over the field for those Penn State teams going forward, and frankly, I'd be a little bit surprised if he was not a high draft pick, barring any type of injury throughout his career, just because of how talented this kid is and how athletic he is. It's going to be really hard for NFL GMs to overlook him at the offensive tackle position. And then you have Matthew Outen, a very talented four-star wide receiver, also going to Penn State, number 5 wide receiver in the country. So another team in Penn State that very much needs this. They need to add as many wide receivers as they can. Harrison Wallace has come on incredibly this year, but they're going to need more guys. There's no two ways about that. They're going to need to compete with the Ohio States of the world and the Oregons of the world going forward. And the thing they do incredibly well is bring in those really talented skill players. Penn State's going to have to follow them in that. So it's going to be really interesting to watch that unfold, but a great addition with Matthew Outen here. I think this is a guy that almost definitely will have an impact right away because you're going to lose likely Julian Fleming and a couple other guys after this year. You're going to need guys to fill in, and I think some of those guys are going to be younger like Matthew Outen. Walter Mathis Jr. is someone I want to talk about for a little bit because LSU has been doing incredible work on the defensive line since they brought in Bo Davis. This is a kid from Savannah, Georgia, so they're bouncing around all over the place wherever they need to be able to pull off this defensive class, and they've done a really incredible job. I think Blake Baker's doing an awesome job. Kevin Peoples has to be doing just incredible work on the trail, and then whenever you're coming to play for a developer like Bo Davis, not very hard to sell to those kids. You know what this guy is about. You know that he just put 2 guys in the NFL that a couple of, or DeAndre Sweat at least through 1 week is looking really incredible at the NFL level. So you have to feel really confident if you're going to play for Bo Davis, and I think it's made all the difference in the recruiting for LSU. Obviously has not gotten the on-field expectations that you would love to have for LSU, but I think they're going to be coming along, and I think in the recruiting world, they're doing a really incredible job thus far. Rashad Johnson Jr. is a very interesting one. He flipped from Georgia to Texas A&M, and he's out of Bushnell, Florida, and this is a very huge get for A&M. This is a guy that was committed to Georgia, was committed to T-Rob, a very good recruiter, and Mike Elko was able to sneak him away. A very talented player, and one of those guys that you look at this A&M back end, it's solid going forward. It's not necessarily where you'd like it to be. I think there's a number of things that they're going to have to fix on that back end, and then once Bryce Anderson walks out the door, you're going to have a lot of issues on that back end. So they're going to have to fill in with as many big-time safeties as they can, and Rashad Johnson is a great addition to this group. I think whenever you have someone that T-Rob really wants and you can get him in your class, then you're likely doing something right. So A&M, a huge commitment there, and definitely want to keep this guy in the roster for as long as you possibly can. Myron Charles is someone that has flipped from Florida State to Texas, 4-star defensive lineman, number 4 defensive lineman in the 2025 class, and this is yet another reason that Florida State's got to win this weekend. There are more and more guys that are looking other directions. In fact, we'll talk about another one that decommitted from them not too long ago here in a second, but the reality is Florida State needs that high school recruiting. If they're going to move forward as a program, if they're going to bounce back as a program, they need high school recruiting. And if Texas is going to steal all their guys from Florida, they're going to have a big-time problem on their hands. So they got to win this weekend. They got to get this thing back on track, and we'll talk about a couple of the players that are going to be there this weekend here in a second. But another one is Ty Jackson, a 4-star linebacker committed to USC a couple of days ago. USC just keeps pouring into this defense. They're doing an incredible job on the field, obviously, and people are noticing off the field. And I promise you, if people notice that USC has a good defense along with that Lincoln Riley offense, it's going to be terrifying for everyone to recruit against this group. I think DeAnton Lynn is making all the difference and cannot wait to see what they do with the rest of this class. Oh, excuse me. Moving on to this 2026 class, an edge rusher 4-star Xavier Griffin Haynes has committed to North Carolina. Very, very big pickup for North Carolina. It feels like they keep getting those big-time recruits every now and then, especially at the edge position. Feel like they're doing a really, really good job there, and I think one of the big-time questions for UNC as they move forward is, what happens with Mac Brown? You know, how long is he around? And for these 2026-27 commitments, is he someone that is going to be around for these guys when they come around to play at UNC, and does that play a factor in some of these recruitments going forward? Another elite player in 2026 is Zaylus Hicks. He is committed to Texas out of Carrollton, Georgia, top 25 recruit in 2026, and this kid is very, very talented. And I think this is one of those things that you've really noticed with Texas recently is they're going into Georgia, they're going into Florida more often, and they're winning a lot of these battles, particularly in the state of Florida, have done an incredible job there, and I think it's one of those teams that's just going to be so hard to beat if they're going to be able to go into those states and beat out teams like Georgia and Florida State and Miami and all of those other teams. It's going to be nearly impossible to keep up with Texas on the recruiting trail, particularly with the NIL money that comes in as well. So a ridiculous, ridiculous run for them, and a lot of it has to do with players out of the state of Texas. So really impressive work from Texas. But let's get into a couple of scheduled commitments and intel. Jerome Miles is the big one coming up on September 18th, so next week, mid-next week, and this one's really interesting. He's down to A&M, USC, and Utah. I think Utah is leading in this one. I think they've led in this one for quite some time, but USC is pushing really, really hard. I think they're definitely going to be a team that has a real shot here, and this is a 5-star receiver, so playing for Lincoln Riley tends to be a little bit more enticing than playing for Kyle Whittingham, but who knows? Maybe he wants to stay in his home state. Maybe he wants to play for the Utes and be a part of kind of changing that kind of ideology around Utah. But a very talented player, one of those guys that whoever gets him is having a very, very good time on that Wednesday next week. But overall, I think I'd lean Utah right now, but USC is going to have plenty to say about this one before it's over. Another Florida State player that has decommitted is Javion Hilson. This kid is a beast. He's the number 2 defensive end of the class, and he decommitted from Florida State a couple of weeks ago, I believe last Sunday, and a very talented kid. He is going to be at Florida Texas A&M this upcoming weekend, so Florida's a team to watch here. Miami's also a team to watch here. It sounds like Texas has a lot of smoke. They've gotten a couple of different crystal balls for this kid to commit to them, and it'll be interesting to see if he can make his way over there. It sounds like this one's going to be a little bit more played out than a lot of these other ones, so definitely strap in for this one. I think we'll see a couple more visits from him before we see a commitment, but as of right now, it seems like Texas is doing a lot of really good work and definitely could pick up yet another commitment from the state of Florida. And then we have a couple of guys that are going down to Miami this upcoming weekend, and one of them is Michael Carroll, the number 1 interior offensive lineman that is committed to Alabama right about now. And I think this is one that Miami's going to have every chance to flip, because the reality is, you look at that Miami offensive line, it's hard to not love that if you're a recruit. There are so many talented players, particularly young players, that have already come along such a long way that it's going to get really interesting. I think Miami is pushing for a number of different players right about now, and I think they could definitely get their hands, especially on a offensive lineman like Michael Carroll. And then you have Elijah Griffin coming in, a very talented number 1 defensive lineman in the country. If you can get him in this class, you're going to have a ridiculous class for Miami, and things are going to continue to roll down there in Coral Gables. I know Georgia is pushing for him very hard, so we'll definitely keep you updated there, but would be huge for Miami. And then you have Michael Terry heading over to Texas this weekend to take in the UTSA game. I'm just expecting this guy to commit at really any point, if I'm being honest. I think this is one that Texas likely has had locked up for quite some time, but he just wants to make sure all of his I's are dotted, all of his T's are crossed before making that commitment, but I expect him to be a Texas Longhorn by the end of the month at the very least. And then finally, we have a couple of guys going down to Florida State for the game this weekend. They have to do a good job this weekend, and Tarvis Alford is a huge reason for that. Ohio State commit at linebacker, very talented kid out of Vero Beach. They need to be able to lock up a couple of these guys. And then they have Malik Clark in town and Peyton Joseph, 2 commits on this roster. They got to keep those guys intact. They have to win this weekend, or you would likely see a lot of these guys that I just talked about, Malik Clark and Peyton Johnson. I think it's very real that they would be out of that class very quickly. So Florida State has a ton to figure out on the recruiting trail, and this weekend's going to be huge for them to do that. But let's take our final break here, and when we come back, we're going to do a little bit of a headline wrap-up, just all the stuff that we haven't gotten a chance to get through throughout the week with all of the games we had to cover, but we'll definitely get into all of that right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just did a little bit of a recruiting update, all of the things that have happened since the start of the season. It's been a pretty crazy time around the recruiting world, so wanted to make sure you guys were fully updated there. But let's get to a little bit of a headline wrap-up. There are so many different things that happened throughout the weekend. I want to start with Sharon Moore. He has officially signed his contract with Michigan. This one took a little bit of time, and it's very interesting kind of how this played out overall because it was weird that this came out when it did. I think there were a lot of people expecting this to be kind of under the wraps, at least for the time being, because it came out last week that he didn't have a full contract signed, and then they lose a game, and then he signed a contract. It just feels like a very weird way for Michigan to go about this, but overall, he does have his contract signed. It's going to be 5 years, $5.5 million a year. Obviously, exactly what you would expect for the Michigan head coach. I think there's a couple other bonuses in there. Winning the national championship is $1 million. A number of different things that can play in to up that total. But right now the hard part starts, which means keeping that job. It's going to be very tough, especially with all of the different stuff going on around Michigan. His job just got a lot tougher, and it's going to be really interesting to see how all of this unfolds. But overall, I think great for him, obviously, getting that contract on the books, making sure that he has his money on paper, because it was very, very interesting circumstances right there for a second. I was a little bit worried about Sharon Moore there for a second, but glad he got his contract. I think a lot of fans are going to be very happy about that, but could change very quickly if this season does not go the way that they want to. So going to be really tough, and now it's time to really get to work and keep everything on the tracks for Michigan football. But moving forward, we have another headline around Michigan, but this has to do with Denard Robinson and Braylon Edwards. They're filing a $50 million class action lawsuit against the NCAA and the Big Ten Network, essentially about NIL earnings, and saying they were unlawfully denied NIL earnings throughout their career, and they are entitled to that. And you're going to see a lot more of this. This is just the reality of college sports right now, and it's another reality why I kept talking about this NIL stuff and revenue sharing and all of this stuff. I always started it with the NCAA should have been doing this 10 years ago, and this is the reason why. Because at a certain point, these guys were going to come for their money, and it's going to get more and more exponentially higher as more cases come out. So it's going to be interesting to watch that. There were a couple other guys listed in this case: Mike Martin, Sean Crable, 2 All Big Ten defenders, very, very talented players. So you got 4 people to deal with from the former Michigan football teams, and I think this is one of those things that you're just going to have to see a lot of this happen, and the NCAA is going to have to pay out a lot of these players, and it's going to really hurt them going forward. It's one of those reasons that I think the NCAA looks okay right about now. I think it could look terrible in a couple of years as more and more of these players get the guts, more and more of these players start to sue them and say, we want the money that we were entitled to when we were in college. So it's going to be really interesting to watch this unfold, but the reality is the NCAA should have done this 10 years ago. The fact that they didn't is a little bit ridiculous, and now the players are coming for their money. So I'm not necessarily going to fault Denard Robinson or Braylon Edwards for doing this. It's just going to be one of those things that you're going to have to see happen pretty much across the country around a lot of these programs going forward, and the NCAA is going to have to find a way to deal with it. And frankly, they made their bed and now they're laying it, as far as I'm concerned. But moving forward, Geno Smith had some very, very interesting comments around Jeremiah Smith, his cousin. He said that Jeremiah Smith could be or will be the best receiver of all time. And I know it's biased. I know it sounds crazy. The reality is, I'm not putting anything past Jeremiah Smith right about now. He is a terrifyingly good receiver. He's one of those guys that you started to hear stuff about in spring, and you started to hear how many crazy plays he was making, how awesome he was doing at spring practice, and you're like, yeah, he's a very great athlete, not necessarily surprised he was making plays, but it's going to take him time, right? He's going to probably be the number 2, number 3 option, and then maybe work his way up through a couple of years to become that top guy on this team. It took him about 2 seconds on that field to be the number 1 receiver. He is absolutely ridiculous in a room of receivers that are absolutely ridiculous, top to bottom. So he's one of those guys that stands out among a bunch of other just absolute athletic freaks. He is the athletic freak. That is absolutely insane. And one of those guys that, frankly, I know that best wide receiver ever is well in the future for him. But the reality is this kid is just incredible. He's going to be so much fun to watch in college throughout his career and then into the NFL. Cannot wait to see this kid unfold. And I would say Geno Smith is dead wrong. I can't say that right now. With how Jeremiah Smith is playing, has 11 catches, over 200 yards, 3 touchdowns through 2 games in his career, and it's going to get a lot better for our Ohio State fans and for Jeremiah Smith. I don't know if he's going to be the best receiver ever, like Geno said, but the reality is this kid is absolutely different in every sense of the word, and I would not necessarily put it past him to be the best receiver of all time. So going to be really interesting to watch that. If Geno Smith is right, then maybe we have to give him some flowers a little bit down the road, but for right now, I think Jeremiah Smith is fully worried about the Ohio State season and doing well there before he worries about anything else. But I wanted to talk about this for a second because I had some beef yesterday, and I think a lot of people around the college football world did with this thing that happened at Purdue. They had a fan that came on the field, and he did a little bit of a contest, and the contest was you had to kick a field goal from the 10-yard line, the 20-yard line, and the 30-yard line. If you hit the first one, you got a $100 gift card. You hit the second one, $150 gift card. If you hit all 3, though, you get a 2-year lease on a car or $5,000 cash. That was the deal that was on place. And the kid hit it. He hit all 3 field goals. It was incredible. The fans went absolutely insane. It was an awesome moment. And then the company came in and said that he was 0.07 seconds late on his last kick and that he was not going to get the deal that he had been promised at the outset of this. And everyone went crazy. Everyone online said that they had to do right by this kid. They had to make sure that he got that lease or the $5,000 cash, whatever it may be. And it sounds like they have kind of been bullied into submission here. Rohrman Automotive Group seems like they're trying to fix the situation. They're going to give him the option of the 2-year lease or $5,000 cash. They're also going to donate $5,000 to the Rose Aid Brigade, the student section for the Purdue home game. So a lot of really, really cool things here, I think. Shows you the power of the internet when you can get a lot of people moving in one direction, and in this case it was getting this kid his car. It's very, very cool to see this all this unfold. I was ready to get on here and get very angry at these individuals because the reality is 0.07 seconds is nothing. You don't need to worry about that. He made 3 incredible kicks and definitely deserves that moment. So really happy that this got resolved and glad I did not have to get on here and get mad at anyone today. I'm glad this was handled before that because did not necessarily want to get riled up this early on in the morning. But let's get into Steve Sarkisian. There was a very interesting kind of tale that was told by him early on during this week when he was talking about this upcoming game against UTSA. Texas obviously coming off that huge win against Michigan 31-12, just absolute domination. A huge signature win for this team and definitely a game that can make you a little bit complacent, but he's using that Notre Dame game from a week ago to kind of keep his team intact. There are a lot of people that going into that Notre Dame game just said, take care of business, move forward, and that's exactly what I said, and that's not what happened. They were 20-plus point favorites, and they ended up losing by 2 points at home. So Sark is trying his best to avoid that this upcoming weekend against UTSA, and I can promise you UTSA very much wants to do that this upcoming weekend against Steve Sarkisian. So it's going to be really fun to watch that one unfold. I do think Texas is going to be more than fine in this game, but it shows you how many different people are going to utilize this type of idea, because you got to make sure your guys are locked in. Even for these UTSA games that might seem a little bit tedious as you head on to SEC play, you lose this one, then Texas is in a very different position than they are right now. And their CFP odds go just plummeting down with a lot of the games they have on that schedule coming forward. So I think a lot of people around the country are using this right about now. They're saying, do not be the Notre Dame. Take care of your business. But UTSA is definitely coming in there trying to be that NIU of this weekend. So definitely something to watch. We'll see if Sark's messaging worked for his team. But finally, a couple of quarterback updates I wanted to get on y'all's table. Cameron Rising is unlikely to start in Game 3 against Utah State. Sounds like he has a injured finger on his throwing hand. We saw that last week when he, I believe, just ran into a helmet on one of the plays. Or no, he got ran out of bounds, excuse me. But it sounds like it's going to be Isaac Wilson, Zach Wilson's younger brother, starting in his place. He went 4 for 9, 30 yards last week. He's got to be better this upcoming week. But it is Utah State, makes things a little bit easier for this offense and a little bit easier for that kid. But it sounds like Cam Rising will be back for that Oklahoma State game, but it's still something to watch. We have to make sure that that's going to be the case, because if it's not, then Utah's season gets a little bit more sketchy by the day. So it's going to be one of those that we're watching very, very closely. He will not be out there on Saturday, but he likely will be out there the next Saturday. We're just going to have to 100% make sure of that before we get out there. But finally, Billy Napier has named Graham Mertz the starter for this Saturday. I talked about it when I was previewing the show, or this game, excuse me. I do think that Graham Mertz is the better option of the two. I think he's the more confident option, especially against a team like A&M that is going to get after him so aggressively. But the thing is, you're going to want to see DJ Lagway. These fans badly want to see DJ Lagway, so it's going to be fascinating to see how he handles this. I don't really know if there's a right way to handle this, frankly, if you're Billy Napier, but it's an absolute tightrope walk, and if you walk out of that A&M game losing and having not necessarily played these guys the amount that the fans want, you're officially done at Florida. So it's a huge weekend for him, obviously, and this adds just another little bit of flavor to that thing. And then Connor Wegman, he has been listed as questionable on the injury report for the other team, and it sounds like it could be Marcel Reed leading A&M out of the tunnel on Saturday. If this is the case, then flip my pick to the Gators, because I do not necessarily love this team without Connor Wegman. I don't necessarily love this team with Connor Wegman, but I know that he is a little bit better than the other guys on the roster, so I'm a little bit worried about this one. I think he'll likely play, but as of right now, it looks very, very questionable to say the least. So definitely going to be interesting to watch that one unfold. And then finally, this is a crazy weekend. This is one of those weekends where a lot of people get lulled into a false sense of security. They get comfortable. They say there's not too many big games out there. Just stay vigilant. At the end of this weekend, we're going to be a quarter of the way through the regular season, so watch all the games, take it all in, especially tonight. UNLV could pull off a shocker against Kansas. There's so many big-time games this upcoming weekend that maybe you're not looking as too big-time right now. They could become crazy in a hurry. I can promise you that. So stay vigilant, stay locked in on college football, because there's going to be moments this week that we do not expect. I can almost promise you that. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. We have really incredible people doing awesome work across every single sport you could want. So if you're only a college football guy, that's more than fine. But if you want to expand your horizons, get over to all of the other stuff we have on this page, and we totally have you covered in the world of sports. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys on Monday. Enjoy some games this weekend.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.